Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are plunging into, well, a really fascinating period of English history.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking the later years of King Charles II's reign, complex politics, shifting alliances,
Hmm.
and then right through to the brief, pretty tumultuous time his brother James II spent on the throne.
And the material we're drawing from is this detailed historical account really lets us get into the weeds of the events, the people, and the forces shaping this era. It's quite dense, actually, full of insights.
Yeah, so our mission here is to unpack this, to
Hmm.
dig into the key events, the big figures, the deep conflicts described in this text, just so we can understand how England navigated these, well, choppy waters after the Restoration,
Swiftly choppy.
which led to some really fundamental changes in government and society. We'll look at the factions, the power struggles, the foreign influences, and some surprising turns the source lays out.
And it's not just, dry history. This period is packed with political drama. You've got
Yeah.
religious insurrections, major naval battles, secret treaties, plots that seem almost unbelievable sometimes. And this source gives us a really close look at how these pressures built up and, well, eventually exploded.
All right, let's jump into the source material then, see what we can learn about post-Restoration England.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
So the source kicks off describing this initial push for unity right after Charles II comes back. Seems like a deliberate effort to bring eminent men into the council.
Yes, exactly. Including people from different sides of the recent conflicts, Presbyterians alongside Royalists.
That's crucial, isn't it? After so much division, the idea was kind of foster reconciliation.
Figures like Annesley, Ashley Cooper, Hollis, Manchester, say, names from various sides during the Civil War and Commonwealth. The source suggests it was about securing affection, for the king and the country.
And Parliament, according to the source, they responded pretty positively, especially about the act of pardon and indemnity.
They gratefully received it, is the phrase used, even acknowledging the guilt of the former rebellion. It was a cornerstone, really.
But reconciliation only went so far, right?
Well, yeah. The source notes exceptions, big ones, like the judges involved in Charles I's trial.
Yeah, we weren't getting pardoned.
No. And there was even talk from people like the Earl of Bristol wanting wider exceptions, which caused a bit of alarm. But the source says the king really wanted the act passed, so that helped ease fears. It was a careful balance.
Trying to move forward but not completely ignore the past.
Exactly.
Feels like Charles II's personality played a big role here, too. The source has this interesting bit about his propensity to pleasure actually helping.
Yeah, helping banish those sour and malignant humors.
Mm-hmm.
The idea being his more relaxed court culture shifted the national mood after all the Puritan intensity.
Mm-hmm.
Though the source adds a critical note. It says maybe some public bitterness lessened, but it was sometimes replaced by private disorders hurtful chiefly to the individuals. A subtle point.
Right. Different kinds of problems, maybe. And amidst all this, personal stuff was happening, too. Deaths in the royal family.
Yeah, the Duke of Gloucester, the Princess of Orange, both died pretty soon after the Restoration. Smallpox for Gloucester, I think.
A time of public celebration, but private loss for them.
And the Queen Mother visited, arranged Princess Henrietta's marriage to the Duke of Orleans, strengthening those French ties again.
Meanwhile, Parliament's busy setting up the money side of things. Post office, wine licenses, the hearth tax.
Laying the financial groundwork, and crucially, getting funds to pay off and disband the army, that was a huge step away from military control.
And they did it quickly, before dissolving.
Apparent unanimity, the source says, shows that initial eagerness for stability, for getting back to normal after years of upheaval.
Okay, let's talk Clarendon. He seems absolutely central in these early years.
Oh, definitely. The Chancellor. The source describes him as instrumental, tempering royalist revenge, making sure the king kept his promises, or tried to.
Use the brake on the hardliners.
That's how the source portrays him, yeah. Working to make sure those who'd supported Charles in exile weren't totally forgotten. Within limits, of course.
And his own life got complicated. His daughter, Anne Hyde, marrying the Duke of York secretly.
Oh, yeah. Big scandal potential there. An unequal alliance, the source calls it, especially when she got pregnant.
And Charles allowed it. Out of pity for Clarendon.
Apparently, Clarendon supposedly didn't even know. Highlights those personal dynamics at court. The source says Clarendon himself felt uneasy about his rise, almost like he saw trouble coming.
Interesting. And while his administration gets praised, the source hits hard on his religious policy. Narrow and bigoted.
That's the phrase, yeah. A key criticism within the source. Politically moderate, maybe, but religiously rigid. This led to reestablishing the Anglican hierarchy, bishops, liturgy.
And kicking out nonconformist clergy.
A lot of them, yes. There was this declaration meant to appease Presbyterians' promises about bishops and ordination, but the source implies it was mostly for show.
Just maintaining appearances while the church party pushed its own agenda?
That's the suggestion. A gap between stated moderation and the reality of pushing for a strong, uniform Anglican church with Clarendon driving it.
The source also comments on the government itself, not yet fully bound by law, using the king's prerogative.
Yes, the idea that prerogative, the king's inherent powers, was needed to restore ancient order out of the chaos.
Necessary that may be, but sets up future conflict.
Precisely. That reliance on prerogative becomes a major sticking point later on as people demand stricter limits.
Speaking of chaos, there's this wild story about the King Jesus insurrectionists.
Oh yeah, believing in an invisible leader, fighting bravely against the local militias, the train bands, it's a vivid picture of that lingering religious extremism.
So convinced they thought God had deceived them when they failed.
That's what the source says. And Clarendon's ministry used it, of course, to argue all nonconformists were dangerous.
Even though the source suggests its madness meant it wasn't some big coordinated plot.
Right, it seemed too small, too fanatical for that.
Okay, let's shift focus. Scotland. The view in England was it'd be easier to manage.
Yeah, because it was run by nobility, supposedly. Not like England with its spirit of democratical equality. That shaped policy at first. Disbanding forces, raising forts. Parliament seemed compliant under Middleton.
But things went south quickly. Acts against covenants, arbitrary fines.
Yes, and the source says the fines were imposed ignoring the king's own rules. Even when Charles wrote to stop them, the local administration just carried on. Middleton's government is described pretty harshly, riot and disorder.
Making people see his rule, maybe even his religion, as profane.
That's the implication. And despite the people being generally submissive, they got no relief. It just led to harsher measures.
Like the Conventicles Act, copied from England. Yeah. Suppressing meetings, using the military.
Exactly. Which then sparked that Western revolt, incited by preachers.
Which was crushed brutally by Dalziel, followed by vengeance, hangings.
Led by figures like Archbishop Sharp. The source mentions many could have saved themselves just by renouncing the covenant.
The king did step in eventually to stop the executions.
He did, yes. Ordered releases for those promising obedience. But the source adds, sadly, it was too late for many. A really bleak picture of how things were run there.
Much harsher than in England, it seems.
Often seemed less subject to the king's direct control, yeah. Exacerbating all those deep-seated tensions.
And Ireland. Still reeling from Cromwell?
Heavily influenced, yes. Native Irish expelled, confined, lots of innocent people lost land. Even loyal Protestants like Ormond had suffered. The Dublin Parliament was dominated by soldiers and adventurers who'd benefited.
And there was that foiled plot at Dublin Castle. And the weird bill about Irish cattle.
Seems minor, but telling. Declaring Irish cattle imports a nuisance. The source says the real point was to stop the king using his prerogative to allow exceptions.
Parliament trying to clip his wings, even through trade laws.
Looks like it. The lords tried to remove the word nuisance, but the king made them put it back just to get the money he needed from the commons. Shows that tension over royal power simmering away.
Back in England, the political lines are hardening. Court party versus country party.
A clear division emerging. Fueled, the source notes, by offices and even bribes secretly given. Clifford is named as starting this.
Though the king didn't have unlimited funds for that.
Right. Poverty of the crown limited it. And you have Charles acting as if government were a pastime, according to the source.
Which contrasts with Parliament digging in, especially against Catholics.
Absolutely. Commons voted against toleration bills despite the king's hints. Religion trumped royal preference there.
And that big fight between the houses over the Skinner case, Lords acting like a first instance court.
Yeah, the Commons challenged that hard. It wasn't just procedure, it was a fundamental argument about the powers and boundaries of each house. A recurring theme.
The source paints some vivid pictures of key figures too. Buckingham, great talents, no judgment.
Classic courtier type, yeah. Powerful but unpredictable. Contrasted with Argyle, affable, well-bred, never persecuted anyone, which the source highlights as rare.
Yet, even Argyle gets linked to the king's neglect of writers. Butler dying poor, Dryden struggling.
It's a small detail, but powerful. Shows the courtly world wasn't everything. Even cultural figures could be left high and dry. The source even lists things like deciding cases improperly or taking money as charges in Clarendon's later impeachment.
Right, the Second Dutch War. Big factor here, driven by money needs and the Duke of York wanting glory.
Definitely. The Dutch were strong under De Witt. Declaration of war leads to these major sea battles.
The 4 days engagement, Albemarle, brave but rash, Berkeley defeated.
Yes, and the St. James fight, fierce heavy losses, admirals killed on both sides.
The Dutch retreated from that one due to sickness, not defeat.
That's the detail the source includes, yeah. And Louis XIV is watching nervously, worried about his own navy.
Peace talks started Breda, but drag on. The old Amboyna spice tree issue comes up again.
And then the disaster. The Dutch raid on the Medway, burning English ships in their own waters, Captain Douglas going down with the Royal Oak.
A disgrace at Chatham, the source calls it bluntly.
A total humiliation. Damaged the government's reputation badly, weakened the king, and really hurt Clarendon. His downfall comes right after this.
Okay, let's unpack Clarendon's fall. Several reasons given.
Yeah. As the king felt more secure, he relied on him less. Their priorities diverged. Clarendon opposed Charles's Catholic leanings, tried to protect liberties, checked the king's spending.
And he wouldn't deal with the king's mistresses,
Yeah.
like Mrs. Palmer, the Duchess of Cleveland.
Right. The source says this opposition made him seem unfit in Charles's eyes. If he wasn't on board with the king's measures, he was out.
Meanwhile, the old royalists, the Cavaliers, felt forgotten, despite some money being distributed.
They felt the act of indemnity, protected enemies, and forgot friends. That was the common view among them.
So Clarendon gets impeached, but argues he acted with advice, and the charges didn't quite stick as treason.
Procedurally, the impeachment failed on the treason charge, but politically, he was finished. The king's favor was gone. He had to flee to France.
His fall marks a real turning point then. Charles getting rid of ministers who block him personally.
Exactly. Signals a shift in how Charles intended to rule.
While all this is happening in England, Louis XIV is rising in Europe. The source describes him quite compellingly disciplined, industrious.
But with that enchanting, noble air. His ambitions were huge, especially regarding Spain's potential decline. This worried the Dutch a lot, and the source links Charles's stubbornness at Breda and the Medway disaster partly to these bigger European games.
Which leads to the Triple League, England, Holland, Sweden, against France.
Ostensibly, yes. Triggered by Louis grabbing Franche-Comté. The Dutch were wary of England, though. Remember past inconsistencies.
But Charles mediated it. It was popular in England.
Yes, seemed like a strong move against France, promised parliamentary support.
But here's the twist. The source says Charles secretly ditched the Spanish alliance and made dangerous connections with Louis.
This is pivotal, the secret deal. 1 million livres a year from France. The source is clear on motives. Money against Parliament, enlarging his own authority, maybe even altering religion.
Wow. So the Triple League was partly a front, or at least quickly abandoned.
It seems his domestic struggles and desire for independence from Parliament pushed him towards France. France became his financial backup.
Though the French doubted England initially, and Parliament stayed suspicious.
Deeply suspicious, especially about Catholicism. They kept voting against popery, went after Danby for his dealings.
And Louis was playing his own games, telling the Dutch that Charles was unreliable, controlled by Parliament.
Yep, and warning Dutch nobles about the Prince of Orange's ties to the English royals, a sophisticated diplomatic game playing on existing divisions.
The Nijmegen peace talks reflect this mess. The Dutch ambassador deals directly with France.
Seeing England as unreliable, yeah. Van Beverningh gets orders to sort it out with Louis.
Resulting in worse terms for Spain, France gains ground.
Exactly, causing great murmurs in England.
Yeah.
People blame the king's delays and favoritism towards France for strengthening Louis.
And the source details actual French bribery of English figures.
Oh, yes. Lists prominent names.
Yep.
And points out only Lord Russell and Lord Hollis refused the money. Others took bribes or presents.
The source judges this harshly. Worse than rebellion, almost.
Well, it says rebellion is technically more criminal, but the French connection made taking the gold seem particularly bad to the public. Paints a picture of widespread corruption, foreign influence, really setting the stage for the next crisis.
Which is the Popish plot. Starts with Kirby and Tongue telling the king about a murder plot.
Yeah.
Based on Titus Oates.
Yeah, Oates, whose initial story the source calls improbable, inconsistent. But a Dr. Tongue vouched for him. It gets to the Privy Council, then Danby.
And the king was not happy. Danby took it to Parliament, predicted it would ruin Danby and harass the king.
That's a key insight. Charles saw the political danger immediately, truth aside. Parliament, though, ran with it. More anti-Catholic measures.
Then the event that lit the fuse. Sir Edmund Barry Godfrey's murder. The magistrate who took Oates' statement.
Found dead, strangled, sword run through him after death. Money untouched, the cry immediately went up, Papists killed him.
The source says this created a general delusion. Public prejudice became absolutely incurable. Panic, rage.
Huge funeral procession. Rumors of invasions, assassinations everywhere. It confirmed Oates' stories in the public mind.
But the source itself floats an alternative theory. That the popular party staged the murder to blame Catholics. Shaftesbury, maybe?
It does raise that possibility, suggesting Oates might have been directed, especially since he'd initially cleared Danby and Ormond. It shows the source's critical stance, hinting at deep political manipulation.
Parliament definitely acted on the plot fears. New Test Act, declaring popery idolatry, excluding Catholics from both houses.
Yes, though excluding the Duke of York from the Lords only just passed, they also debated if bishops could vote in capital cases against the accused Catholic lords.
And that militia bill. King refuses, won't give up the power of the sword. Commons holds back money.
A classic Parliament using the power of the purse. No more funds until they felt secure from popery. Shows their priorities.
Danby's impeachment comes back, related to France. Montague produces that letter, proving Danby acted on the king's orders.
Yep. Commons impeaches him for high treason anyway. Crucial clash. They insist ministers are accountable even if following orders.
Lots of legal wrangling. Does impeachment survive dissolution? Parliament dissolved, new one called, impeachment continues. Danby flees.
He absconds, yes. A bill of attainder passes the Commons but stalls in the Lords. A really messy, high-stakes fight fueled by the plot panic shows the deep distrust between king and Parliament.
The plot trials themselves. Coleman convicted based on Oates and Bedloe.
His letters showed indiscretion, but the conviction rested on their testimony about commissions and plots. 5 Catholic lords locked in the Tower. Lord Stafford tried by the peers.
Accused by Oates, Dugdale, others, maintained his innocence on the scaffold.
Yes, denied the extreme doctrines blamed on Catholics. Convicted, but by a surprisingly narrow margin among the peers, 35-31.
Others convicted too, but some acquittals, like Wakeman, despite testimony from Oates, Bedloe, and Prance.
And the detail about Prance retracting then reconfirming under duress, it highlights the questionable methods used.
The source is pretty damning about this whole period. Hostility to doubters, Parliament reaffirming the Horde conspiracy.
It calls the violence a disgrace to liberty, and suggests even the prosecutors suspected it was ill-grounded, but kept it going for political advantage. A very critical assessment from our source.
This intense period leads straight into the exclusion crisis. All about stopping the Duke of York from becoming king.
Right. Charles tries to appease Parliament, sends James abroad. There were even schemes to promote Monmouth, Charles's illegitimate son.
But Charles shut that down, declared Monmouth illegitimate.
Firmly rejected it, yes. Made it clear Monmouth was not in line for the throne.
Shaftesbury gets made president of the council, but still sides with the popular party.
Seems he realized he didn't have real influence at court, so stuck with his base. Shows the king trying to manage things, but figures like Shaftesbury still driving opposition.
The core issue, the exclusion bill, stopped James because he's Catholic. The source lays out the arguments.
Yeah. Exclusionists. Parliament is supreme, can change succession for public good, popery's too dangerous, necessity demands it.
Opposition. Succession is divine right, can't be altered, changing it means civil war, duty of path of obedience overrides danger, a fundamental clash.
Absolutely, about the very nature of government.
Bill passes the Commons, but fails in the Lords. Halifax's speeches were key.
That's what the source highlights, and it suggests Charles cleverly anticipated this, letting the Lords take the heat for rejecting the Commons Bill.
Charles then dissolves Parliament, calls a new one in Oxford. Tension running high.
Palpable, yes. Exclusionists revving armed. Shows it was getting really serious, beyond just debate.
And amidst this, the Fitzharris incident, a messy affair involving libel and double-crossing.
Yeah, Fitzharris writes this libel, gets encouraged by an exclusionist spy planning to expose him, then tries to play both sides. Ends up claiming the court hired him to write it to frame the exclusionists.
Which the source calls absurd.
Right. The Commons tries to impeach him, Lords rejects it. This dispute adds to the reasons Charles dissolves the Oxford Parliament very quickly.
He feared more attacks on ministers, saw the opposition wouldn't budge.
Seems so. Both sides left Oxford fast. A real showdown averted, but the division was stark.
After Oxford dissolves, royal power seems to bounce back strongly.
It does. The court party rallies. People start questioning the excesses of the exclusionists. Even the reality of the popish plot itself is doubted more openly.
This lets Charles decide to govern without Parliament.
Why?
Prerogative.
Exactly. And a key move is that quo warranto action against London's charter.
Challenging their right to the charter because they'd petitioned against Parliament dissolving, seen as sedition.
That was the justification. Huge legal battle, but the court finds against London, charter forfeited.
Yeah, but then restored with conditions. King approves mayor, sheriffs, can remove magistrates.
Yes. Major conditions giving the crown significant control over London's government and elections. A massive power grab.
And other towns followed suit, surrendered their charters.
Seeing what happened to London, yeah. They surrendered them, got them back with similar restrictions, dramatically increased crown influence nationwide over local government and who got sent to Parliament, if one were called.
This period of stronger royal power then leads into the Rye House plot.
Right. A conspiracy involving familiar opposition names Monmouth, Russell, Essex, Sidney, others, planning insurrections. And alongside that, a more radical plot to actually assassinate Charles and James at Rye House.
Discovered by Keeling, West and Rumsey turned state's evidence, confirming the assassination part.
Yes. Rumsey's testimony leads to more arrests. Essex dies in the Tower suicide or murder. The source leaves it open.
Lord Russell is tried, accused of intending the king's death via rebellion. Legal issues with the indictment.
Source notes it used an old form, making the legal basis somewhat irregular. Convicted on evidence from Oates, yes, him again, Lord Howard and Rumsey.
Appeals for pardon fail. King's inflexible. Maybe retaliation for the Catholic executions?
Source suggests Charles felt harassed by the Country Party. Russell was a key opponent. Retaliation is hinted at. And there's that detail about Russell's wife helping him calmly.
His execution is described with some pathos. Courageous, protesting innocence of plotting murder, but couldn't deny insurrection plans.
A difficult position. Algernon Sidney also tried. For treasonous writing possessing a manuscript critical of government.
Evidence from Lord Howard and the manuscript itself. But major legal weaknesses.
Big ones, according to the source. Manuscript unpublished. Only one witness, Howard. Law required 2 for treason. His conviction and execution are called a blemish on the reign because of this shaky legal ground.
Monmouth gets pardoned, reconciled, then disgraced again.
His rollercoaster relationship with his father continues. Still a complicated, ambitious figure.
Foreign policy in this late period, Charles relies even more on France.
Drops Spain completely. Louis even offers to make him an arbiter in a dispute with Spain, but Spain refuses, seeing Charles as too biased towards France. Shows where his support lies. Now he's ruling without Parliament.
The source touches on economics, too. Revenues settled on Charles seen as awkward. Not enough for independence, too much for dependence.
Exactly. Burdened by debt. Revenue grew but wasn't enough. Forced reliance on Parliament or France.
Navigation acts boosted trade, though. English commerce grew rapidly. Dutch wars actually helped.
That's the argument in the source, yes. By clearing rivals. Trade with France remained controversial, though. Difficulty sending money abroad highlighted financial limits.
Socially, deism spreading among elites. Shaftesbury, Halifax. A reaction against earlier piety.
Source suggests so, a shift towards rationalism, skepticism, away from intense religious fervor among some.
Factions revived. Book licensing continued. Liberty of the press not yet established.
No, not until the Revolution. Shows the state consistently trying to control information throughout this time.
And the literary world. Buckingham's rehearsal, Temple praise, but Butler, Dryden, Otway struggling.
A reminder of the precarious lives of writers, even successful ones, dependent on fickle patronage.
Which brings us right to the end of Charles II's reign and the start of James II's. His first act, assembling the Privy Council.
Yes. Praise Charles, promised to maintain government and laws. But the source immediately adds his sincerity was short-lived.
James was open about wanting a more active government, demanding unreserved obedience.
Very different tone from Charles, sets the stage. Source implies James's own views and close confidants mattered more than the formal council.
Parliament seems loyal at first, grants revenue for life, repeals the Triennial Act.
They do, but the source criticizes this heavily, makes Parliament less important, leaves liberty unprotected, it connects national religion and liberty, predicting the church itself would eventually resist illegal actions.
Then Titus Oates finally gets his comeuppance. Convicted of perjury.
Brutally punished. Fines, whipping, pillory, prison, seen as overturning the whole popish plot narrative symbolically.
Then, 1685, Monmouth's rebellion.
Hmm.
His declaration was pretty inflammatory.
Called James a traitor, tyrant, assassin, accused him of poisoning Charles II. Really extreme stuff.
Monmouth hesitates, though, loses time. James acts quickly.
Brings troops from Holland, sends an army under Feversham, leads to the Battle of Sedgemoor.
Monmouth invites attack. Rebels fight well, but lose. Monmouth's fold.
Source blames Monmouth's misconduct and Grey's cowardice. Lots of slaughter afterwards. Monmouth caught and executed. Brave on the scaffold, apparently.
At the same time, Argyll's rising in Scotland fails quickly.
Defeated almost without a fight. Argyll caught, executed on that prior sentence. Rumbled, Alof also executed.
The source really emphasizes the cruelty after these victories. Faversham hanging rebels without trial. Colonel Kirk.
Kirk's cruelty is highlighted, yeah. Hanging people for sport. And then Judge Jeffreys and the bloody assizes.
Source says he wantoned in cruelty. Mass executions, fines for pardons, whippings. The Prideaux example.
Paying £15,000 for liberty without knowing his crime. Chilling. Made the law seem as bad as military rule, the source says.
James gets overconfident after this. Undervalues Parliament.
Elated by prosperity, yeah. Tells Parliament the militia is useless, he needs a standing army. Asks for money and allowance to employ Catholic officers. Needs that dispensing power.
Parliament gives money, but pushes back on the Catholic officers.
Yes. Votes for an address asking him not to. Shows their resistance to him overriding laws like the Test Acts.
But James is determined. Uses the Hales case to try and get judicial backing for the dispensing power.
And the judges mostly comply. Rule the king can dispense with penal laws in specific cases for government needs.
Though the source points out the revolution ended all that and abolished the power.
Explicitly, yes. The Convention Parliament made sure of that.
James keeps pushing. Disarming Irish Protestants. Remodeling the army. Establishing the illegal High Commission Court.
Using it against opponents, like the Bishop of London for refusing to suspend Sharp over an anti-popery sermon.
And the Magdalen College case, that seems particularly egregious.
Forcing a Catholic president on them, ignoring their own election, expelling the fellows. The source calls it perhaps his most illegal and arbitrary act.
And highlights, James just didn't get his subjects' religious commitment. How strongly they felt.
He didn't grasp that their zeal for their church and laws could match his own zeal for Catholicism, especially among traditionally loyal Anglicans.
So he tries courting dissenters with declarations of indulgence, toleration for them and Catholics.
A tactical move after alienating the church. Many dissenters were wary, saw it as a trap. But the source says many did express compliance, partly out of old bitterness towards the church.
His approach in Scotland showed his hand, tries Parliament, fails, imposes it by prerogative anyway.
Revealed his true intentions, yeah. Meanwhile, relations with Rome weren't great. Sending a nuncio was illegal. And Louis XIV, busy persecuting Protestants himself, actually fell out with James, thinking he was getting too close to William of Orange.
So James wasn't perfectly aligned with Rome or France either.
No, his actions created complex dynamics, and opposition kept growing. William of Orange becomes the focus.
Educated Protestants worried about religion and liberty looked to him. Secret approaches made.
Yes, through his envoy Dykvelt, key figures start defecting. Even military men like Admiral Herbert, Admiral Russell, politicians like Henry Sidney.
And crucially, Whigs and Tories unite against James. Tories ditch non-resistance.
That's a massive shift. Faced with James undermining the church and law, even loyal Tories felt they had to resist.
William forms a league against France, gets troops from German princes to cover Holland, prepares the invasion secretly.
Remarkable secrecy, the source notes, all leading to 1688, the Revolution, William's declaration, preserve religion and liberty.
Lands at Torbay, general defection from James, even his army.
He tries to rally support, fails, realizes only Catholics are truly loyal now, fears his father's fate, decides to flee.
Sends wife and son to France first, then goes himself, leaving England leaderless.
Without government, the source says, an unprecedented moment, leads to the Convention Parliament.
Intense debates, conquest, regency. Tories argue indefeasible succession. Whigs say James unfit, election needed.
The key fight, did James abdicate or desert? Was the throne vacant? Whigs push abdication, implies voluntary act, creates vacancy Parliament can fill.
Commons votes abdication and vacancy. Lords resist vacancy at first, want to keep hereditary principle.
Yes. Leads to that free conference between the houses. Subtle arguments. Whigs avoid condemning Tory principles or mentioning the infant prince to keep unity against James.
Commons insists. Lords eventually comply by a narrow margin.
Some peers switch sides. The vote passes. William and Mary proclaimed joint monarchs.
The source wraps up with some legacies. Lessons learned about revenue from Charles II. Better system after the Revolution.
Yes. Navigation acts boosting trade reinforced. Commerce grew overall, maybe helped by Dutch wars clearing rivals. Abuse of power like Clarendon's impeachment serving as a warning.
Deism among elites, the struggling literary world. All part of the picture.
Paints a picture of an era wrestling with huge questions. Power, law, religion, society, everything was in flux.
Wow, that was quite a journey. A really fascinating deep dive. It's incredible how quickly things moved, from Charles II's complex maneuvering to James II's, well, direct confrontation that just blew everything up.
It really is. The source just lays bare those deep tensions over royal power, parliament's rights, religion, always simmering, the pace of events, the personal stakes, the shifting loyalties. It's quite astonishing when you lay it out like that.
And how much, personal character and maybe just bad political judgment layered on top of those big forces could just accelerate everything, unravel things that seemed stable.
Absolutely. And this period fundamentally redefined that relationship between the monarch and the people in England, set clear limits on royal power, established precedents for constitutional government, protecting those liberties people fought so hard for.
It really makes you consider, doesn't it? Looking back at how quickly that landscape transformed in just a few decades, how much do those unpredictable human factors, the personalities of leaders, still shape history, even when these huge societal forces are playing out?
That's a great thought to carry forward. Definitely something to mull over.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you feel a bit more informed about this really pivotal era in English history.